Okay, so we're on to our final session of the day, and we're going to have a talk from Ryan Simpson from Boningale Nurseries, sorry. So if Ryan's there, it'd be good if you could pop up, see your face. So Ryan has got 30 years of experience in the horticultural world and is the sales manager for Viridis plants, and he's worked in multiple roles, both across the landscape, wholesale, retail, landscape sectors, both in the UK and in Australia. And so they say, Ryan, you have a detailed and in-depth understanding of how the trade functions and how it needs to adapt to keep up with a growing number of risks to the industry. So we can be the judge of that at the end of your talk. But
I hope so.
yes, indeed. So if if you have any questions for Ryan, once again, please, at the end of his talk, we will ask questions. You can either put them in the chat or again raise a virtual hand, and you can ask Ryan a question yourself. So let me hand over to you. Thank you very much for joining us today, Ryan.
Can you see my screen?
I can indeed. It is very good. Yes.
Brilliant. So thank you for joining me on this presentation. I've been a member of the Plant Health Register now for about a year. I was quite shocked when I was asked to do this because in my head I was just at nursery level, kind of making sure we're doing everything that the scientists and the governing bodies and everybody else are instructing us to do to keep our borders safe, keep our wildlife safe, our industry safe. So it's quite nice to be asked to talk about the ground level, the nursery level. It's been quite interesting listening to all the work that everybody's doing throughout the plant health industry, the world of plant health. So hopefully this will kind of put it all into perspective of what all the work you do means to us who is selling the plants and getting the plants into the ground in the end. So I'm going to talk a bit about movement of plants. We're going to look at propagation, production, the sales and sourcing of plants, incoming, outgoing plants and the risks involved, ongoing surveillance, and of course looking at a bit into the future. So movement of plants. It's probably nothing new to say this is where the biggest risk of transmission of pests and diseases is, whether you're transporting it around the world, just around Europe, or even just from, we've got two nurseries a couple of miles apart. Any point that a plant is removed from an area, or even beds within a nursery, once it's moved from one area to another area, there is risk of and transmission. So we do a lot of work to try to minimize that risk, even though our job is to move plants around, whether get them around from Europe into us or just to get them out to our customers around the UK. And we deliver all through the UK, so we have a wide scope of movement of plants. So it's very important that we are doing the right thing to make sure that risk is as minimal as possible. So we're looking at the incoming plants in the production. So either our propagation, if it's from our mother plants, that they're healthy from the movement from sites. Propagation material is coming from nurseries we trust, nurseries that follow the same ethos of plant health, registered in Plant Healthy, for example. We've also got the movement of mature plants that are ready for sale. We need to make sure they're from nurseries we trust, they're verified, we're checking them. We've also got to think about if for any reason plants have to come back to us, whether customers change their mind or various reasons why plants may be returned, how are we going to make sure that they're quarantined, that we're checking them, make sure we haven't brought anything back from that site. And our customers, when we're delivering to our customers, we need to make sure that that stock has been checked, there hasn't had anything gone wrong, or it's not caught anything, or they didn't have symptoms when they arrived, but now they've manifested into something we need to double check at every point. So although something may have been perfectly fine when it arrived, we need to double check that when it's going out. It could be a week, it could be a day, it could be a month. So this kind of work always has to be done ongoing. That's where the surveillance comes in. So when stock comes into us, we're checking it, but then it goes on a bed until it's ready to be delivered, and it's checked regularly, and then it's checked on the way out. And in the future, the movement of plants, technology is going to play a part, for better and for worse, I think. So the technology is meaning we can connect more nurseries up. For example, we're part of the plant market group in Holland. They've got 450 nurseries that they link up to. So we can be buying from 450 nurseries in Holland or around Europe, plus the ones we've got in the UK. They're all linked together. So it's very easy to buy lots of plants from lots of different nurseries, which means there is a higher risk. The technology will also mean we have a better way of identifying risks, manage risks, and reduce that risk likely to come into our nursery and then affect the wider UK. So prevention is definitely the best thing, really. So where do we start? We start with our compost. So when we're doing any production, we have to start with compost. The compost needs to come from a reputable producer, manufacturer. They need to work on that it's been treated correctly. I did actually have our APHA inspector ask me what the European restrictions are on compost, and it wasn't something that we thought of before. So that's something that I'll be going back to our suppliers just to ask what restrictions they have on compost, how they look after it, how they treat it. We use bales. This means that we can keep them completely sealed, so they're heat treated, they're sterile, they've been wrapped. So until we open it, they should stay sterile. There's no pest or diseases, no weeds getting in. Historically, you used to have a delivery in a truck, it dumped it in a potting compost bay, and then you take it as you need it. I think that's long gone now. This tends to be how most nurseries that I've seen do it, and it just means that we can be sure that it's healthy compost, ready to use, that aren't going to transmit anything that may have, I don't know, blown in. So yeah, to keep sealed. Pots, we use fresh pots, clean pots. We make sure they're disinfected and make sure that there is no risk of them being a vector for anything. We get a lot of questions from our customers about recycling pots. Well, you can just wash them and clean them, and yes, but so far the risk of recycling pots, cleaning them, disinfecting them, even trying to just make sure the size is the same, because there's so many different varieties of a 2-litre pot. When you think about machines and putting them on beds and deliveries, the logistics behind it, the ability to make sure that they are 100% clean, etc. It's just really challenging. So we find the best thing to do is to physically recycle those pots back into the raw material to be produced into new pots. Young plants, the best thing to do is at every stage of production, make sure that the plants are as healthy as possible. So we check the material that is being propagated. We're checking the young plants that may have come from our own propagation or we've bought in. We remove issues at every point. So anytime we see any issue, it is removed. And that way, no risk of it being manifesting to a wider issue further down. Using integrated pest management is keeping the overall pest numbers down through a natural system is far better than using any chemicals. The more chemicals you use, the more times you're going to be killing those beneficial insects. So the more we can use integrated pest management, the better. And of course, general husbandry, making sure the area is clean from the potting through production, cars are clean, beds are clean, vehicles are clean, people's shoes are clean. It all adds up into an overriding best practice in preventing that anything's moved from one site to another, from one bed to another, etc. So starting at the start of the plant journey, we've got propagation. So we'll either use our own stock, our own mother stock, to produce the propagation material through cuttings, or we might buy in seeds, or we might buy the plugs with propagated plants ready to go. With the mother stock, we need to make sure the mother is healthy. Any weak plants, anything that looks like it's not going to grow away strong, which would mean that the plant itself is susceptible. Make sure that none of the plants that we use have any sign of any pest and diseases, even minor. Any minor pest and disease can manifest into something worse, or it would allow something to infect it and kind of take over. We know what happens when we're not well. You're more likely to get something else as well. We make sure that equipment, so if you're propagating and you're using secateurs, knives, etc., every time you have a different batch, so you have different plant groups, different genuses that you'll be propagating on a day. Every time you take stock from a different plant, from a different batch, from a different area, the equipment should be clean, the benches should be cleaned, all materials should be removed before you start the next one. That way, if there is anything within a batch that has got past all the checks, because at the moment it's not showing any symptoms, any signs, at least then that's contained to just that batch. You haven't then spread it to your propagation you've done further on. The beds that you're putting all this stock onto, they should be cleaned regularly. Every time a plant is moved, the area underneath disinfected, swept, clean, especially if there's anything being identified, why that plant was removed in the first place. But that regular cleaning, checking, ongoing is all very important. And then monitoring. You've done everything else right. The plant's on the bed, it's starting to grow, putting on roots, or it's growing away nicely, but you need to make sure you're monitoring it. There's something could not have been visible when the propagation was happening, so now it's manifesting itself, so now you can identify it, now you can get it removed and start checking the vicinity. It could be that something's come in through the wind, vectors, insects, so you need to keep on monitoring that. But also that record keeping can be used for coming years, where you may have learned something, may have identified something. A year or the next time you're propagating could be a long time. So you want to be able to review that, make good changes to make sure that nothing is happening in the future. So you've had your propagation, you've got your young plants, they're ready to be potted on. Watering, very important. So we have to make sure our water is clean. That's the first thing. We use a mixture of UV and chemical. Trying to move to UV as much as possible because we don't have to use chemicals. Then the volume of water, that's very important. You can have a stressed plant from being too wet, and you can have a stressed plant from being too dry. So it's finding that happy medium. You've got lots of automated systems within the nursery, but nothing beats a trained eye, making sure that one variety, one genus that requires more water is in a wetter part than the plant that may require less water, and making sure everything's in the right place. We're not wasting water, we're not overwatering, we're not underwatering. The humidity and airflow in amongst that is also very important, just to make sure that you're not producing a breeding ground for any diseases or any pests. Feeding, from a young plant point of view, the root's the most important. So you're not wanting to put feed on that gets them growing away too quickly. Nice, lush growth is much easier to attack from a pest and disease point of view than harder grown plants. So if you can work on getting root growth over top growth, then you're going to be minimizing the ability for pests and diseases to get into anything. Once they get out into the wider nursery and they're growing on in their full-size pots and we want them to get size, that's fine. But if they're growing hard enough, it just reduces the impact of that. As I said before, integrated pest management. In an ideal world, we wouldn't spray. So the more integrated pest management we can do, like a theta beetle, which is to control the scarab fly within the propagation unit, that we're trying to use as much as possible. And in every sense, do we have to spray? Is there something else we can do? What's the cultural improvements we can be making to reduce that? Yes, there is always a chance when we need to use chemicals, but the more we can reduce it, it saves us money, of course. It also is better for the plant, for the environment, and the product we produce. And again, record keeping, just keep on keeping records, because the more records you can keep, the more communication we have around the business, the more everyone knows what's happened, how we got to where we are, and anything we need to change for the future. Production. So we've got a nice plant that's going into its full-size pot. So we're only as good as our base material again. So young plants are then graded again, make sure that they're clean, no sign of damage, they're growing away strong. There may not be any sign of disease or pests, but if it's a weak looking plant, it will produce a weak finished plant. So there's no point spending the time and the money growing it onto being a saleable size, because it's never truly going to get there or be the value that we think it should be. It also, if it's a weaker plant, more likely to be attacked, which means it's more likely to form an area where the pests and diseases will get in and then spread to the healthy plants. So they're removed. We make sure tools are clean. We're using the correct compost, clean pots, and the correct amount of fertilizer, because again, we don't want these plants to grow away too quickly and produce lush, leggy plants that mean that the pest can come in and attack it because it's a nice, easy meal. We make sure the working area, growing environment is continually cleaned. So again, like we did with propagation, when you change a batch, when you change genus, when you change to another growing type of plant, we stop, clean, make sure there's no remnants of the old batch, just so if there was an issue in the previous one, it's not transferring to this one. And a spray program is planned at that point. So you aim not to use it, but you have the high risk pests and diseases that may affect that plant, know what you're going to use, when you're going to use it, and the most chance of it actually becoming an issue. Certain times of the year are going to be high risk. That's when you monitor it. If you can catch it very early, use an integrated pest management or chemical, you don't have to use as much. It doesn't have the same impact, and you can clear it before it gets to a wider issue where you may lose the whole batch or it spreads to other batches as well. So sales. So this is where I come in mainly. So my role is sales. And within my role, being a plant health professional, I work to train the sales team and keep them updated. So the rules, the regulations, the risks are continually updating. So we need to make sure that we're kept up to date, communicate with the other departments, whether it's the purchasing team, production team, our customers, because they may see something or hear something, or through Defra, APHA, all the governing bodies that feed information through. We need to make sure that we as a team know the rules, know how we can make the best decisions, make sure we're not recommending or selling plants that are high risk. For example, we don't sell olives in the nursery. It's a decision we made very early on that we don't think we can control the risks enough to justify an outbreak of Xiala, for example. So we have ongoing conversations with our customers to discuss the risks. I do training sessions with our customers to identify what the risks are, what their involvement in plant health is, how do they make a difference? Do they recommend plants that are high risk, that moving them around the country, moving them from Europe, for example, is going to be a higher risk than possibly another plant that does the same job, but they can do, and that will minimize the risk. So it's an engagement with our customers to make sure that they fully understand, and they can have the communication with their customers as well, who in the end are the ones who are planting the plant in the garden or in the commercial environment. Continual monitoring and communication. So we have a sheet that goes around regularly that lists all the restrictions, where we can get things, where we can't get things, what should be avoided completely, etc. It's always changing. If something's all of a sudden been identified, restriction being put on, we may not hear about it until something stopped at the border, or our suppliers will inform us. So we make sure that purchasing is always in discussions with what we're doing. Also keeping an eye on Defra and just general talking about plant health issues, restrictions, movement concerns, just to make sure that we're not inadvertently trying to bring something in that's going to be an issue. And then also very importantly is the purchasing team in the UK, at least. We're regularly going out to our suppliers. We're making sure, are they plant healthy registered? If not, what are they doing to make sure that their plants are healthy, they're not spreading anything? We're monitoring, making sure that when things come in, they're okay, trusted suppliers. And within Europe, Plant Market, who are our owners, they regularly check their suppliers as well to make sure that they're complying and making sure that anything they bring over from Europe is going to be healthy and there's no risk associated from what they're doing their end. So as we said, the movement of plants is the biggest risk. So it used to be beginning of the year that the changes, the checks were done at our nursery. So we were a destination, a point of destination. Now the checks are happening en route. And from my understanding is that the plant phyto certificate being identified, high risk plants are being put in a must check, and then they're checking as much as possible. From what I've heard is that not everything is being checked. It's kind of looking at a hierarchy of risk. So the highest risk items are being checked, and then there are some, because they just don't have time at the moment, capacity at these points to check everything. Some of it's going through. Because of this, our nursery surveillance needs to be increased. So we need to make sure that our teams, our pickers, our dispatch team that are pulling stock off trucks need to be really switched on, making sure that they're keeping an eye on every single plant that they're unloading. If anything looks slightly off, or they don't quite know why the plant doesn't look right, they can't identify it, it's brought up to a more senior member of the team, production manager, production director. Then it's been identified. APHA used to come in and check on every load. Because of the changes, that's not happening. That's happening on route. So they come in periodically. So those visits are becoming much more important, because without them coming in, we're almost in our bubble. So it's always good to have someone come in that's seeing the wider industry, what they're seeing, making sure that we haven't got an issue that they've seen elsewhere, and they're switched on to what's about. They're seeing it more regularly. So having them on site is always good. And because they're not coming in on a weekly basis, it's making sure that when they are on site, we use them to the best ability, just to have a look at what we're doing, making sure there's nothing we can do better. So the pickers, packers have major biosecurity roles. They're the front and the end. they're the ones who take it off the trucks. They're the ones who put it back on the trucks. So if anyone's going to notice anything, it's these guys. So they have a really high and challenging role to just keep up to date as much as possible. So they're part of the training, updates, and making sure they're fully aware of what's going on. And also with the movement of plants, phytosanitary certificates and plant passporting has never been more important. So the phytosanitary certificates that's done on the nursery that's coming from over in Europe, for example, if there's an issue there, it's not moved. And as we said, if the plants aren't moved, it's best, because the movement is what transports it. And then the passporting, if we can track it to where it's gone, if there's an issue that is identified and we can give the right information to Defra, APHA, and they can track the plant to its final destination and deal with the issue, then again, that helps to minimize any risk on the ground of it getting out. So climate change. We said about the dispatch team, the unloaders are front line, the end line. Climate change is increasing the risk. As climate is warming, the insects, the pests, the diseases that we think we were likely to see are changing. We're seeing things that we wouldn't expect. We're seeing things that are surviving the winter, like the Asian hornet that I've been hearing about all over the news, that it's the first time this winter that they survived, which means they are now here and likely to be here for good. So they will be seeing issues that weren't expected. So being kept up to date and identifying things that historically would be something you wouldn't see or wouldn't be a risk because they would just die off so quickly, they would never reproduce, never become a long-term issue. Now they may do. So we need to make sure that everybody within the nursery is fully aware of this changing ecosystem, the changing risks that we see. Which brings me on quite nicely to the future. So where do we see the future going? We're going to be seeing increased risks due to climate change. As I said, we're going to see different pest diseases coming over, whether it might be from one area of the UK to the other. In Kent, you've got the pine, the oak processionary moth. We've got areas where you can't import out of oaks, so we can't physically import from a UK nursery to our nursery if they're within that area. So that's becoming a risk. You've got the imports from Europe over to here, and the different increasing number of pests that will cause issues within our nursery, within our industry, without the social economic issues that have in the nursery within the UK. It's all going to get harder and harder with more issues. The more restrictions we see within trade, especially from Europe, the more emphasis it's going to be on our own production within the UK. Historically, we could get so much from the Europe so easily. There was an element of nurseries not investing heavily in space to be able to grow larger volumes, or lines that could have been easily secured through Europe. As that changes, as we have more restrictions, as the importing of plants becomes more difficult, there is more emphasis on UK grown nurseries to expand, to grow more, to have bigger production units. So we're seeing that in our own production. We've taken on a nursery up in Edinburgh to start growing trees, because oaks, for example, are difficult to import of any size, or you can't import them of any size. So by identifying where the restrictions are or going to be and trying to forward plan our production, it means that we're getting some sustainability within our industry. And if we can grow our own stock, even better. The less carbon footprint of transport, etc., is all going to be good. And peat-free, etc. We've got a better peat-free emphasis within our industry than Europe does at the moment, for varying reasons. So that's all working to our advantage and our detriment. Depends on how you look at it. AI, I think, is going to form a big part of predicting and identifying possible pest and disease incursions. So the work that the scientist community are doing around the world, they're pooling all the information. AI hopefully is going to be able to identify trends, see where they're being found, and put restrictions in place or recommendations in place before the chance of it getting into our environment is even there. So I think AI is probably going to help, whether you love it, whether you hate it. I think AI will help. You've even got the part of when I am quoting plants to a customer, I'm basing that on my knowledge and what the restrictions are, what could go wrong, what we should be avoiding. AI has the ability to pick up these issues and update regularly through portals, etc., that mean that they're removed from my site or flag as an issue. It could be designers for domestic gardens, designers for commercial projects. There could be programs within there that AI can get all the data they need, and they can anticipate what those issues are, what plants we shouldn't be moving around because of that increased risk. And it makes it harder for the industry to recommend to sell these items, these plants that are at higher risk of transmitting. So I think that's kind of where we're heading, and we're seeing it more and more with even our programs. So I think that's how the future is going to be dictated to, is AI, and it will be identifying for us where these risks are. That's me done. Hopefully that's been useful, and hopefully you've got some questions for me.
Thanks very much, Ryan. Indeed, that's it's very interesting to hear kind of the on the ground sort of activities that go on into in a nursery, and how you have to prepare for these different health threats. Okay, yes, indeed. So if anyone has any questions for Ryan, please put them into the chat. Here we go. So Lou Jones has come in with a question right away. Thanks, Ryan. I'm concerned about the cost implications incurred owing to UK propagated plants being passed on to consumers. So do you have any comments on that?
So I'm guessing this is talking about Holland and Europe do everything in mass production, so costs can be kept down. We've got the issue of peat-free compost, not an issue. I'm all for peat-free, but it does have a bit of a higher cost. So yes, there is, in the short term, UK production may seem slightly higher, but what we're seeing is all the increased regulations in transporting plants from Europe over to the UK, also with the increase in transport costs. We're seeing the pricing just to get a plant from Europe over to us increasing. So actually, whereas our products may be slightly more expensive, in the long run, it actually works out to be on par, just because of all the other elements of the phytosanitary certificates, the checks happening for plant health, the transport itself, the trucks, the drivers, all of that kind of elements, that the further you travel, the higher the cost gets. So I think it is going to even itself out, and you won't really notice it one to the other.
Okay, cool. So Rachel Barker's got a question, and I was going to ask something similar if we had radio silence from everyone. So she asks about successful examples of IPM. So you mentioned the scarab beetle that you've been using, but I wanted to kind of expand on that as well, and about the kind of financial implications that you have to, or the financial decisions you make for if you want to implement an IPM strategy versus just spraying. And so if you can talk about that a little bit.
So I think I don't see the financial side of buying the chemicals or the integrated pest management in my role, but I know that if something goes wrong and you need to spray loads, you haven't kept on top of it, then it's going to cost more. I think the benefit of integrated pest management is you might have an ongoing cost with maintaining the population of the integrated pest management in tunnels, in areas.
Mm-hmm.
But over the long term, I think that cost is kind of leveled out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's more, you can plan for it, you know it's going to cost X because you're doing it on a regular basis. If you did nothing and only sprayed when there was an issue and you weren't monitoring correctly, and the cost of chemicals going up and down, you end up with a cost that you just can't quantify. You don't know when it's going to come, you don't know when you're going to have to pay it out. And I think if you looked at it over a longer period, over years, you'll see that integrated pest management done right will actually cost less than your chemical usage.
Okay. So prevention rather than cure. So can you mention about any other examples of IPM that you've been using apart from the scarab beetles?
I knew you were going to ask that, and I was going to check in with the production team, and I didn't get a chance.
Okay,
so sorry about that.
There are other examples.
There's low. I know there's there was 2 or 3 last time I went around the nursery that I saw different containers with different labels, but I should have looked, but I didn't.
No, it's all right. That's all right. You can't have the great knowledge of every single thing. So we've got a question from Elizabeth here about a bit about careers. So asking about, do you have any issues with bringing early career people, younger people into your industry, and where do you recruit people from to join?
It's amazing. So before I was at Boningale, I was working for a retail chain, and my role was an apprentice manager and training. So I regularly was trying to fill apprenticeship level roles within the industry. The biggest challenge I found was finding educated, knowledgeable people who, from a school's basis, you go to a school and say, I'm trying to fill some places on an apprentice for retail nursery level 2. And they go, oh, here's some students, they're unlikely to pass. So they're trying to push you the low achievers within education, which is not always bad. I know there is a lot of people who struggle in an education environment and then will really fly when it's given a practical element and they can really grasp it. But it's also removing the people who have the most potential to move into the science, horticultural science, etc. And lots of you spoke today about where you start, and you started at the bottom in a horticultural level training, and then you've moved into science. If we can't get these people who have the potential to move into science, then you're not filling all the positions. So we are finding it really hard to find. You can find people who just want a job and they're just willing to do anything. They have no horticulture knowledge. We're willing to train and develop, but it gets to a point where there's only a certain amount of information they want to take in because it's a job. Finding those passionate horticulturalists who really love plants. My hobby is going around to gardens looking at plants. When I have a day off, I'm in the garden. My life is plants. But finding people who share that passion, who just want to know plants and then find their level where they're happy with, whether it's working in a garden center, talking to customers, inspiring customers, or whether it's building yourself up into a high level science position where you're making scientific improvements for our industry. It's really hard at the moment, and there's not enough focus within schools and the general policies that are happening that are really pushing people to think that this is a credible career that has some rewards to it. It's not the best paid job in the world, You have to truly love it.
Yeah, finding a group of young, passionate horticulturalists who will fill a mini might be a challenge at the moment, unfortunately. But I'm sure you can, you want to bring people in who have got that interest, certainly. So we've got a couple of questions about AI, and so the first one from Joe, who asks whether you think, and your knowledge of how the AI will work in your industry, whether it might prove any threat to you, and have you learned either using AI or your knowledge of other disease risks, whether there are any risks coming in from elsewhere in Europe, Asia, America that you're really looking out for, that you could use AI to help mitigate those?
So I think we'll end up using a cyber physical system with AI. I think historically, the horticultural industry from a nursery level is very basic. You've got sheets of paper, you've got Excel spreadsheets. We run a system where we import plant lists from our growers, and we're able to quote and manage all of that. Europe, that happens really well. They're really switched on. We struggle sometimes to get a list of plants from our grower. They go, "What do you want? I'll tell you if it's there." So I think the movement from technology within the industry is, we're behind other industries that embrace technology really quickly. So I think we're going to see it move from that kind of disjointed machinery, technology, lists, whatever it may be, to a point where we're connecting it all and it's all communicating with each other. If a nursery updates its stock holding on the ground, it feeds through and we'll end up seeing it, so we know that we can sell these to the customers. And I think there's an element where we need to build in that plant health. We need to link into the governing bodies that are making these rules, making the risks assessments, all the issues with transport, that they need to start feeding in as well, and have the ability to impact our choices based on the restrictions and minimize any risk of it. And our customers, designers, they use programs. They also should be linked in to make sure that they're using plants that are lowest risk, aiding our environment, not causing any risks or being an invasive species, for example. Plants that are risks that we're seeing. I think, just trying to think of anything most recently, I think it's probably about a year or two now, but the biggest one was pine processionary moth, that all of a sudden we had all these orders on, and then overnight we suddenly got told that everything stopped, nothing was moving, and then we're running around trying to figure out what it was. So I think when things are being identified, the communication between everybody needs to be better, which is where I think AI will come in. Defra or somebody else will press a button and say, "This is an issue." That should then feed out to everyone, and then it flags straight away, so we don't go a certain way down the rabbit hole before we have to stop it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I see. A more responsive system. Yeah, okay. So related to that, just to pick up something you mentioned, I think in your talk about olive, and you don't have any olive trees in your nursery because of the threat of the xylella. Is that right?
So very early on, we made a decision that there was a ban on any movement or trading of Olia. There is the ability to trade Olia. You can make sure you're from the correct areas. Growers are being very careful. The transport is being very careful, but we just don't feel that the risk of it, even a very low risk, is worth it. So we've gone with it. It's a small percentage of sales from a nursery perspective. We're not one of the nurseries that trade just in olives, and you can imagine that would be a devastation to say you're not allowed to do that anymore. But from our point of view, there are other options we can give. It wasn't a huge financial pain for us. So we felt the most sensible option for us as a nursery was to just say, no, We're not going to deal with them. We're not going to move them. We're going to remove ourselves from all risk whatsoever.